My name is Farhan. In this video, you will solve question 13 from 2022 Paper 1 exam. This question requires you to prepare a suspense account. A student requested help with the specific question, so if you have any other topics you would like me to cover, make sure you post them in the comments. With that being said, let's get started. Ross is completing his draft trial balance, which does not balance. A suspense account is open and the following errors are discovered. We are required to prepare a suspense account to correct the errors and also make sure that the opening balance is clearly calculated. So these are the three transactions which refers to the errors that have been discovered. So let's start with the first transaction. On the right hand side of the screen, you will see that I've also done the workings and I have separated between what has been done, which is the error that has been made, and what should have been done, which is the correct way to record it, and how do we end up fixing any errors. So let's start with the first transaction. Rent payable of £7,600 had been correctly entered in the bank account, but credited to the rent payable account. Okay, so let's look into the section for what has been done on the right hand side. So we know that we have paid some rent, which was £7,600 in total, and we recorded it correctly in the bank account, which means we have used our funds within the bank account to pay for the rent. Now, bank is an asset. Assets by default are debit, which means when they go up, they're debit. Now that bank is decreasing, which means the assets are decreasing for the business, we have to do the opposite of debit, which is credit. So because we have paid the rent of £7,600, bank should be credited by £7,600, which is the correct way to record it, and that is what they have done. As you can see here, credit bank 7,600. However, when it comes to correctly recording the rent expense or the rent payable, they have credited it instead of debiting it. If you are paying rent, rent is an expense that has been incurred in the business. So any expenses by default are debit, which means rent expense should have been debited as the correct entry. So if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that another section for what should have been done. So the correct way to record would have been to debit rent expense because we have paid £7,600 for an expense. And we have used our funds from within the bank account, which reflects a reduction in the balance of assets that we have. And because assets are going down, we have to credit it. So that is why we are crediting bank and debiting rent expense. That is the correct way to do it. But this is what they have done instead. They have credited bank by £7,600 and they have credited rent expense by £7,600. All right, so how do we fix it? So how do we go from here? So the way to correct is also what I have shown here. You can see in red. So if you want to go from here to here, you can see the bank has been correctly recorded. So we can cancel out the bank to begin with. So that is not our concern in the case that we do not have to fix that. But when you look into the rent expense, to go from a credit rent expense to a net value of £7,600 for debit rent expense, we have to debit the rent expense by £15,200 instead. Why is that so? Why is that the case? This might appear to be confusing, so I'll also draw a T account or a ledger account for you to make sure you understand what's happening. So let me draw the ledger account for rent expense here, and I want to show you something. We understand that they have credited rent expense of £7,600 in the books, which means if you were to go to the T account for rent expense on the credit side, they would have recorded £7,600 for bank, but that is incorrect. We were supposed to record that on the debit side instead. Now, how do you fix this? You cannot just cancel out banks, £7,600 from within the T account or the ledger account. There has to be a track record of everything. So for you to have a net result of £7,600 on the debit side of the rent expense T account, what you have to do is instead write bank £15,200. So how do we get 15,200? So we multiplied 7,600 by 2 to arrive at £15,200. Okay, but having said that, if you carefully check again, this was the incorrect record, which was the bank being credited by £7,600, and we want to achieve a net result of £7,600 on the debit side of the rent expense T account. If we only put 15,200 on the debit side, then as a net result, you're left with £7,600 on the debit side for the rent expense. So this is the complication here. So once you have figured that out, the way you correct it, as you can see, we debit rent expense by £15,200. That way it gets taken care of in the net result for rent expense being a debit of £7,600. And then the suspense account comes and fills in the void, the other side, the gap that we have within this entry. So debit rent expense £15,200. And because we do not have anything else to credit, we are bringing in suspense, which is where the missing transactions gets entered. So credit suspense account by £15,200. All right. So that's how you take care of the first transaction. Now let's move into the second transaction. Now, if you have read the marking guide, the second transaction here had a slight mistake in the exam question, but they awarded full marks to students who even did it using the wrong method that was given to them. So let's start with discount received of £2,400 had been correctly entered in the payables ledger. So in the main exam, this was written as receivables ledger, but the correct one should have been payables ledger because we're dealing with a discount received. Discount received is something that you can only get from your credit supplier. So it has to be relevant to your trade payables, who are your credit suppliers and who are what goes into the payables ledger account or from whom you purchase on credit. So that is why it makes sense for discount received to be recorded in the payables ledger and not the receivables ledger, as there was a mistake in the question. Okay, but omitted from the discount received account. All right, so as you can see on the left-hand side here, what happened was that they have debited trade payables by £2,400. How do we know they have done it? As you can see, the first line says discount received of £2,400 had been correctly entered in the payables ledger. So this is the payables ledger where the trade payables total can be calculated. And any transactions relevant to credit purchases or any payments relevant to credit purchases made have been included. So if discount received was included correctly in the payables ledger, then that should have resulted in a reduction in the balance we owe our trade payables or our credit suppliers. So trade payables and credit suppliers by default are credit because they are our liabilities. When there is a discount that we are receiving from these trade payables, that's resulting in a reduction in the liabilities or the amount we owe our trade payables. Therefore, on that basis, to reflect that reduction, and because there is a decrease in liabilities, we are debiting trade payables by £2,400, which is the correct way to do. As you can see, we have also done it for the other side of the section where we were recording the correct entries. But they have missed the credit entry, which was to reflect this within the discount received account itself. Now, the discount received account is an income account. It's an income account, and by default, all income should be credit. So we could have credited discount received by £2,400, which is what they have missed, which is what Ross has missed preparing in the books. And therefore, on that basis, you can see we have included on the correct side that the credit discount receipt of £2,400 should have been also included. Now, how do we fix this? Very simple. We just take care of the missing entry. So we bring that here. So we credit discount received by £2,400. And then again, we have nothing else against to debit against the discount received. So that's where we fill in suspense to come and use the gap. So debit suspense by £2,400. Okay. Let's look into the last transaction for drawings. Drawings of £3,500 had been correctly entered in the bank account but credited to the wages account. Okay, so let's look into where the workings are. So we know that Ross has made some drawings. So if Ross has made some drawings, because it's cash drawings, as we can understand, it's going to result in a reduction in the funds available within the bank. Okay, so on that basis, when the cash drawings have been made from the bank being an asset should reflect a reduction in the balance that it has. And assets by default, or when they go up, they are debit. But now that there's a reduction in the balance of the bank, assets are going down, it now has to be credited. So that is what Ross has done. So credited bank by £3,500. All right. But they have also done something else, which was crediting the wages account by £3,500. And that is also what they have done. Credited wages by £3,500. Okay. What should have actually been done as a correct way? Whenever there are any drawings, it must be debited. And if you ask me why, it's because drawings result in a reduction in the owner's equity. So the owner's equity reflects the investment of funds within the business. So if the owner withdraws some funds from the business for personal or private use, then it should result in a reduction in the balance of equity. Equity by default is always a credit account. So whenever you have equity or whenever you're putting money into the business, you're crediting owner's equity. But when you're withdrawing money from the business, that should result a reduction in the owner's equity, and therefore you have to debit drawings to reflect that reduction. So drawings has to be debited by £3,500, and we are crediting bank by £3,500 because the funds have been withdrawn from the bank account, and bank being an asset is going down, and when asset goes down, we have to credit it. All right. Excuse me. So how do we correct everything now? So how do we go from here to here? You see, the bank has been correctly recorded in both cases. So we can just cancel our bank to begin with, because that is not where the mistake is. The mistake is with regards to the drawings that should have been recorded, but instead they have ended up recording wages. Okay, so the way to correct it is because we gotta first remove the wages. First of all, if wages are credited here, that means that they're trying to reduce the wages. So which means within the books, we have to do the opposite of the credit, which is to debit wages to reflect the fact that no, there has been no reduction. So we are bringing the balance back to its original value by debiting wages by £3,500. Okay. And at the same time, we know that we could have recorded drawings of £3,500, which is to debit, and we just explained why it's a debit, being a reduction in owner's equity. So debit wages by £3,500, which offsets the effect of previously crediting wages by £3,500. Then we are debiting drawings by £3,500. So you see how the total of debits is £7,000. There is nothing to bring in onto the credit side, so we have to bring suspense to fill in the gap, which takes care of all the mistakes that have been done. So the credit is to suspense the total of everything on the debit side, which is 3,500 plus 3,500 equal to 7,000. Okay. Now, how do we fill all these corrections we have done within suspense account? So the suspense account is on the left-hand side of the screen. And to begin with, the balance brought down, the amount that's being shown here is the one that we had to calculate ourselves based on the requirements of the question. So we are going to use the three errors that we have fixed and input them within the suspense account. So let's start with the first one. So how do we do this? All right. So how did we correct the entry for the first transaction? So you can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. So we credited suspense by £15,200. This means that within the ledger account for suspense, on the credit side, which is this side, we have to include rent expense, as you can see here, by £15,200. And that simply comes from the fact that when we had to correct it, we had to credit suspense by £15,200, and that £15,200 came into existence because of rent expense, and that is the description we write here: rent expense on the credit side of the suspense account with an amount of £15,200. All right, so let's move to the second transaction. So when we corrected the second transaction, we debited suspense by £2,400. So let's go to the ledger account on the left-hand side of the screen. So this side is the debit side. And you can see that on the debit side, we have written discount receipt of £2,400. Again, that £2,400 that we had to bring for correcting the errors before was mainly brought to counter against the discount receipt of £2,400. So that is why when you write the description, you have to write discount received in the details section on the debit side, and that's £2,400. So let's move to the last transaction. So in the last transaction, we are crediting suspense by £7,000, and that mainly happened because of wages and drawings, both being £3,500 each. So logically speaking, if you go to the ledger account, you will see that suspense is being credited here by £7,000. And first of all, it's coming from wages by £3,500, and then it's coming from drawings by £3,500. And that's mainly coming from this correction. Okay, so how do we find the opening balance in this case? First of all, let's just assume that we didn't have this to begin with. So let's just assume we didn't have this to begin with, the opening balance. So what we had to do was that we had to calculate everything on the heavier side, which was the credit side, by adding rent expense, wages, and drawings, which would have given us £22,200 in total. That must have been the balance on the debit side of the suspense account, so that we can ensure the double entry rule in accounting is taken care of. So once that is done, you take away the discount received of £2,400 that we have on the debit side. And once that is done, you can get £19,800, which is the opening balance, or the balance brought down in this case, as we can say. So this is how you prepare the suspense account. Now, what about the second part of the question? So Rose had calculated the draft profit to be £86,454 before noticing the errors. Calculate the revised profit figure, taking into account any adjustments required for correcting the above errors. All right. So now that we know we got 3 errors to fix, and prior to these errors being fixed and included as part of the profit calculation, we had calculated a draft profit, which is wrong, and that is something we have to fix now. So how do we fix that? Starting with error 1. What's the logical approach to doing this? So follow me. So when we corrected the entry, so it's very important you know how to correct the journal entries for suspense account. So I'm thinking of dropping more videos regarding the suspense account preparation, because this could be a potential exam question. All right, so we had to debit rent expense when we corrected it, right? Okay, think about it. If we are debiting rent expense, expenses are going up as a whole. And if expenses are going up, then your profit should go down because your cost of business is going up. So if profit has to go down, when you want to fix this error, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen within the table, I have used the £15,200 for the rent expense that was debited in brackets. Why is that so? Because of the argument that we had just made. Expenses are going up. So if expenses go up, the costs go up, the profit should go down. So from the initial draft profit of 86,454, if you were to fix the error number 1, you'll have to subtract 15,200 more, just because debiting rent expense means that expenses are going up. Okay, what about error number 2? So when it comes to error number 2, we have credited discount received by £2,400. Discount received stands for other income, and by default, all income is credit, and that is the main reason behind why we are crediting discount received by £2,400 here. So if income is going up, then your profit should go up. So that is why when you want to fix the second error, you'll have to show 2,400 as a positive figure, which reflects the fact that this is being added to the previous calculations. Okay, so let's move to the last error, which is error number 3. So in error number 3, you can see that wages are being debited by 3,500. So wages is an expense, but drawings being debited by 3,500, that's not really an expense. We had a whole discussion a while ago that how drawings is simply a reduction in owner's equity. If equity by default is credit, then drawings being a reduction in owner's equity must be debited. So drawings is not an expense, it's just an entire category in itself, which reflects the reduction in owner's equity. So the only expense in this case that we have are wages, £3,500. So if we are debiting wages by £3,500, we are essentially saying that expenses are going up. So if expenses are going up in value, the costs of the business are going up. And if the costs are going up, then the profit should go down. So therefore, on that basis, if you want to fix this error within the calculations for profit, you'll have to show it in brackets, which reflects that this is being subtracted again. So once you do all the calculations, you end up with a revised profit of £70,154. Okay, so that's all for today's lesson. If you have any other topics you would like me to cover, make sure you post them down in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and like this video so that you can get more content that I'll be publishing on a daily basis.